Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
Hey, warmer from the low! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the Big XII Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you, as we're going to have a very short first segment here because we are starting to run out of college basketball news and notes. We are now a little bit more than 2 months clear of when the Nets were cut down out there in San Antonio, so a lot of these rosters are now formed. We're still going to have guys moving around in the transfer portal here in June and July, but with it being much less than what we saw here in the last 2 months, with it being much less than what we saw in April and May, I'm going to be starting up a lot more conference previews, which I'm going to be talking to you guys about in a second. And some days we just don't have a lot of news and notes, so you're going to be getting a lot more two-part conversations, and you're going to be getting much more of what I have on this podcast, much like today, as we're going to be joined in a few minutes by Lukas Harkins. He does great work over at Heat Check CBB as one of their main college basketball analysts. He does a great job on the front of bracketology, and additionally he does some great work over at the Field of 68 with his bracketology as well. We're going to be taking a look at some of the impactful NBA draft decisions that we've seen over the last few weeks. He's a man that does a great job with a Patreon page that is dedicated to Butler basketball, so certainly going to be talking a little bit about the Big East, just things in general in this offseason that have been intriguing to him as well. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. Other ways, find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And while I did not have any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. Over at EdgeBoost, they're making sure that bettors are able to access the funds that they have, and they're able to make sure that every single one of your transactions are going to be going through on the gambling front, because it is a bank account which is utilized at any time at your own leisure. When you go to edgeboost.bet, utilize that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That'll get you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And we're going to be doing a lot more conference previews here in the next few days. You may recall I actually did my first conference preview last week. That was with the America East, our good friend Joe Buzzlick, who does a tremendous job covering all things out there in the Northeast part of the country over at stretchingthefloor.blogspot.com. Join me for it. It was a good, fun time. I anticipate doing the Atlantic Sun within the next few days, and this is always a case where it's the smaller / mid-major, low-major conferences first, like the America East. You're going to be getting like the Big South, the Big Sky within the next few weeks, and then we'll do the power conferences at the end. Now, it's a little bit unique with regards to like the Atlantic 10, what have you. I will probably do the Atlantic 10 somewhere towards the back half as well, but I'm a little bit TBD, and sometimes I'll go a little bit out of order. Like, sometimes we might have something like the Big South being in front of the Big Sky, just because that's based on the ability of a guest that has good insight on that conference being able to join me. So we will do a little bit of mixing and matching there, but expect a lot more of those conference previews coming up, because now I do feel like we're at a point where a lot of these rosters are starting to get a little bit more set in stone. We're certainly going to be seeing a little bit more movement, and no matter what, and I can even do all these conference previews in like early October. Even in early October, there's still going to be guys that get suspended, what have you, but I think that we're starting to get into a good place there, and we've got a whole bunch of fun coming up this offseason, and it's my job to be able to make us as much money as humanly possible, get you guys as prepared for what I think is going to be the most magical season of all time in college basketball, and that's what I'm going to be looking to do. So, did want to just give you guys a little bit of an update there, and coming up next, how about if we do talk with our good friend Lukas Harkins, who does such amazing work over at Heat Check CBB, and so much more right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Big XII Family Podcast.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. It is always a pleasure to be joined by this man as we've got Lukas Harkins aboard. He does such a tremendous job over at Heat Check CBB, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. Also does some tremendous work over at Field of 68 during the season as well, mainly with their bracketology shows, as he is one of the best when it comes to taking a look at bracketology. Not an easy sort of venture to go into, but he does a great job of being able to parse through it all. I know that he is very hard at work taking a look at so much in college basketball, including doing a Patreon page for those of you that love what you're seeing out of the Butler Bulldogs, as he's passionate about them, and he, much like myself, a Milwaukee Bucks fan. You're able to follow him on Twitter/X at Hardwired Sports altogether. And Lukas, it's great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks as always for having me on.
Thank you for joining me. And Lukas, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, we got through all these NBA draft decisions, and in my opinion, it really sets the scene for what we're going to be getting this upcoming college basketball season. I'm not sure how you take a look at things, because I know that we're still going to have some ancillary moves. We saw someone like a Desmond Claude head on over to Washington over the weekend, but I think that now is when we can start to feel pretty good about these rosters and know a little bit more about what we're going to be getting for the upcoming season.
Yeah, I think we're finally getting to that point. It's that weird point where you get through the way too early stuff in early April, and then it gets into May, and now we're really starting to find it's going from way too early to too early, right? This transition period where the draft's coming up, we've already kind of figured out where things are mostly solidified for next year. Obviously, we'll still see some roster changes, but things are more solid than they've ever been. In the offseason, we got a little bit of a better picture of who's coming back to college, who's staying in college, and at this point, the transfer portal is also shut down for guys who are entering, barring any other outstanding circumstances. We're getting into a more solid situation with where our rosters are going to be than we were a month ago. And honestly, where we were even last June or even the June before that, I think things are a little bit further along in the process of solidified than they have been in recent years.
Yep, I'm right there with you. And obviously a lot of movement with north of 2,500 guys entering into the transfer portal. But now we're finally able to parse through and take a look at what we've all got and what we got over the last few weeks. In my opinion, were a lot of winners in college basketball. Obviously, a few teams lost out on a few guys, like Duke not being able to get Cedric Coward. That was a little bit of loss for them. And Arkansas didn't necessarily have the best process in late May, early June as well. But I think all in all, with those NBA draft decisions, it really tells me that there's more talent in the sport than ever before. And it really tells me that the money that is being driven in college basketball is keeping these late first, early second round picks in school a little bit longer, rather than these guys I still remember 5 years ago going into the draft, not knowing whether or not they were going to be drafted. Now it feels like they're just wanting to come back to school because they know that they're going to be able to get some good money.
It's an interesting twist this year on what was, the last few years here having extra guys in college with the COVID year as compared to this year, where I feel like we're going to have a little bit of that drop off from not having as much experienced top end talent like we had the last 2 years, with that extra COVID year for some guys coming back and, being those experienced vets who have already proven their worth. As opposed to this year, I feel like we're not having those guys, but a lot of those top end guys who you normally would see go into the NBA draft, maybe they get a first round selection, but they're probably a second round day, but a lot of those guys have come back this season. I think that changes the dynamic a little bit and maybe keeps the level of play rather high, even with how many seniors and COVID seniors left after this past season.
Yep, I'm so glad you mentioned that as well, because I feel like the hallmark of last season, and a lot of people were buzzing about it, was the lack of Cinderella teams in the NCAA tournament, the lack of mid-majors. And do you think that we could see a little bit of a return of the mid-major? And do you think that perhaps last year was just a little bit of an outlier in general with how top-heavy the sport was? Because I just look at what we got last season, and even though maybe we're not going to be seeing a whole bunch of teams like VCU and insert George Mason into like the Final Four, I certainly do think that last year was very much an outlier as well.
Yeah, I think we're always quick to kind of write things off in college hoops if this is the quote-unquote death of college basketball, and it kind of seems like we have this discussion every 5-10 years whenever something new comes along, and then a big run happens. I mean, I think this past year's tournament and this past year's just overall college basketball season wasn't the first time it's been top-heavy in college basketball. It wasn't the first time there's been fewer upsets in the NCAA tournament. Sure, it might have been an outlier as opposed to some of these recent years, and maybe an outlier in the grand scheme of college basketball too. But I think that overall it's not the first time we've had such an outcome happen, and it's usually followed up by a return to the norm, having those Cinderella runs and having really strong regular seasons for mid-majors that then prove that those regular seasons weren't a fluke by the time they get to March Madness. So I think that as it stands, it feels like a one-off. Until this starts happening with more regularity, I think I'm still going to be in the boat of college basketball being in a healthy place as far as March Madness and upsets go.
Yep, right there with you as our good friend Lukas Harkins, who does great work over at HXEBB, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And that does lead me to this, because I do think that what last year was a one-off, but two of those teams that made the Final Four really did get better over the last few weeks as well, especially with Florida. I don't think that they should be like a number one team going into the upcoming season, but I'd be hard-pressed to place them any further down than like 5th or 6th with the fact that they bring back that front court with Alex Condon, Ruben Chinielu coming back. And I feel like Boogie Flan going into the fold from Arkansas after he was considering the NBA draft and came back to school as well. I felt like they had one of the best runs of things in the month of May of any team in the college basketball.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about throughout last season how Florida was so geared behind these go-get-a-bucket guards and a really good front court. You look forward to this season, and Todd Golden kind of already has that playbook for what it takes to win a national championship around that front court. He brings that front court back now with Condon coming back. It's finding those pieces that can replace the Walter Clayton Jr., Elijah Martin group. And Lee and Boogie Flander are two of the best go-get-a-basket, pull-up jump shooters in the country who have not only the ability to create for themselves, but also are really terrific at creating for others. Two of the best assist-to-turnover ratio guys out there are going to take over the backcourt for the Gators. I think the playbook is certainly there for this being a championship caliber team. Obviously, replacing a guy like, an All-American and Walter Clayton Jr. is way easier said than done. But it's hard to imagine going out and finding a better. If you needed to find a full starting backcourt in the transfer portal this offseason, it's hard to have come up with a better one than what Florida got to. And I think that whether they're number one preseason or not is up for debate, but I think they've pretty solidly solidified themselves. Not that it matters, but I think they've solidified themselves as a preseason top 5 team.
Yep, I'm right there with you. And then obviously the other team that was in the Final Four and actually faced off against Florida in the title game that saw a nice, shall we say, rise as well was Houston, because Milo Suzan, a lot of people thought that he was going to be going. Didn't necessarily look the world's greatest with regards to the draft process, some of the workouts, and he decides that he's going to be coming back to school as well. Now, we know that there's going to be a few guys obviously not returning from Houston because they just flat out ran out of eligibility, but how do you take a look at Houston for this upcoming season? Because with Uzan coming back as well, it did lead to a little bit of a ripple effect with Papa Isaacs now heading on over to Texas A&M, team that I think might be solid out there in the SEC.
Yeah, it's not as though Houston doesn't have returning pieces in the front court, but kind of regardless of who they were bringing back or bringing in, I would always feel pretty confident about a front court coached by Kelvin Sampson these days. It's kind of always there, that undersized group that dominates defensively, and I think that there's no problems there in the front court. But it's that point guard spot that's always been super important, and bringing back Uzan really fills in that spot with some experience and program stability that puts them in, similar category as Florida as a preseason top 5 team, in my opinion.
Yep, right there with you. And I do think that with Houston, it's going to be interesting to take a look at them in the Big 12. As joining me on the show, we do have Lukas Harkins, who does such great work over at HXEBB, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And I think that the entire Big 12 is interesting because Houston, in my opinion, has had a rock-solid offseason. They lose out on Papa Isaacs, but that said, I didn't think that he was going to be a great fit with that program either, so not much loss. I think that this worked out very well for all sides because I think the Texas A&M really needed him. But I take a look at the entirety of the Big 12, and I like what BYU has obviously done here in the offseason. They had in there a lot of talent, but I feel like there have been a few schools that have left a little bit of something to be desired. It's interesting to see what we're going to get out of Utah this upcoming season. Not quite sure why Bobby Hurley is still at Arizona State, but he's still at Arizona State. And then for Kansas, they've had a very underwhelming offseason, and I just don't know what to expect for them for this upcoming season because it almost feels like they're falling off with regards to the national hierarchy.
Yeah, I feel like Kansas is one of those teams that got a little bit of the short end of the NBA draft deadline where, the guys that came back to the schools that they were already planning on attending already, whether that's Nate Biddle going to Oregon, Pettiford coming back to Auburn, the guys that you kind of knew where they were going to go once they came back, either they were already coming back to the school they were at last year or they were already committed to their next spot, whether that's Lunenburg and Michigan. It's just Kansas was kind of, I feel like, looking for a couple of those pieces to perhaps exit the NBA draft and be on the market in the transfer portal, and that didn't really come to fruition. With that being said, Kansas is Kansas. Until they really take a step back, I'm going to believe in Bill Self putting together a team that's probably going to get top 4 seed in March. Whether or not it looks like that on paper right now or not, it seems like they're always there year in and year out. So I think that there's going to be, unlike some years past where it's going to be, what you're getting out of Kansas and how they're going to get to that position, it's more of a trust and see what comes out of the process.
Yep, with Kansas certainly having that name brand, and I would have to think that here in the month of June, they're going to be looking at some of these international men of mystery to be able to help out their roster as well. I do think the Bill Self is still going to be able to put out there a good product. Have to have a few question marks with them right now, though, so we're going to see how that's going to be panning out. And then with regards to this conference, it's one that you know very well because you do a great job of covering the the Butler Bulldogs. For the Big East, I feel like they probably had the most silent of the Power Conference teams with regards to NBA draft decisions. The biggest one was RJ Lewis. He decided to stay in the draft, but even if he had decided to come back to school, it was very unlikely that he was going to be going to St. John's. UConn really didn't have a lot of NBA draft decisions. Marquette is Marquette. They really don't have anyone that they bring in by the transfer portal. They didn't have anyone that was out there as well. How do you take a look at the hierarchy of the Big East right now? Because it used to be that DePaul and Georgetown were those bottom teams, and then you had a little bit of top-heaviness with Villanova, who was taking over when Jay Wright was there back in the day, but it almost feels like this conference is at a little bit of a crossroads. We're now seeing all. I take a look at them, and I think that they are very clearly the bottom of the conference.
Yeah, I think that there's a still top-heavy nature to it coming into this year, just with different names. I think UConn and St. John's both have arguments to be preseason top 10 groups, and I see a little bit of a drop-off there. And then there is really a gigantic middle right now where I think we'll see how things kind of play out over the offseason as you look into, how are these guys going to fit together? I think that that's really what's going to determine 3 through, 10 in this league is how the guys that teams brought in, or in Marquette's case, how guys return, how those guys fit together and how they're able to grow and what kind of team they're really going to build. I mean, it's so hard to determine how many of these mid-major to high-major up transfers are going to be, stars in their new roles, or if they're going to be part of what's going to be a depth-oriented team. It's really hard to figure that kind of stuff out at this point in the season until we start to hear some reports from what practices are looking like within those teams, who's emerging as either go-to guys or whether it's going to be, a top-heavy team or an 8-deep team. I think we're going to have to figure that out as the season goes on. But as it stands, really, it feels like that St. John's UConn group at the top, followed by a little bit of a drop-off then into maybe Creighton as that next group to headline what's a really jumbled middle there. You can kind of see go a bunch of different ways. As of now, I agree with you in Seton Hall in the 11th spot, but it's a Seton Hall program that, carries respect over the last 10 years, and that's going to be a program that will compete and play hard every night out, and you never know where they're going to end up in the standings. It's not a DePaul that has been traditionally poor. Seton Hall has been traditionally solid and looks to be in line for a down season, but programs like that don't always have the more down season that you expect.
Yep, certainly. With Seton Hall, would have liked to have seen them add a bit more three-point shooting here in the offseason because I thought that was a big kryptonite of theirs last season. So we'll see how Shaheen Holloway is going to be able to mix and match. And for Butler, I know a lot of people have them towards the bottom half of the Big East, but you said it, it's going to be a very jumbled up middle of the Big East. But I just look at this roster and I feel like there's a lot of upside with it. Like, I love the fact that they brought back Finley Bizjack. He showed me a lot towards back half of the season last year. And then the fact that they bring in Michael Ajayi, I think is one of the biggest X factors in this entire conference, because we saw Ajayi 2 years ago at Pepperdine be absolutely tremendous. Guy that at 6'7" was such a good three-point shooter. And then last year, it just felt like Gonzaga was not a good fit for him. I'm not sure how you're taking a look at this Butler team right now, but I think that's an interesting group that I think that they've got a good blend. I do think that Thad Matta is going to be able to get things online. I think that Xavier Robinson as well, coming in as a freshman, I think that that's a little bit of a low-key, really good get in terms of the freshman class too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to like out of a headline trio, being Finley Bizjack, Jalen Jackson, and Michael Ajayi. I think all three of those guys are very quality offensive players and fit in that system, especially as Jackson comes in and can kind of let Bizjack play a little bit more off ball than he had to play this past season. Jackson's an unbelievably good paint touching guard, which should allow to spray open looks for Bizjack on the perimeter and maybe get Ajayi back into the mix. As a three-point shooter, I think that you hit on Xavier Robinson as a really solid freshman addition. I think Jackson Keith's a guy that I'm intrigued to see how this offseason goes. I'm pretty high on him coming in for Butler. See what we'll actually hear about that once he's on campus and practicing with the team this summer. But Robinson, you're dead on as an in-state guy that I think Butler really likes to kind of be the point guard of the future after Jackson graduates this following season. I think that there's certainly going to be opportunity for him there. My question mark with Butler is really at the 5 spot, Drayton Jones and Johan Traore. They have different stories coming in. Obviously, Jones exceeded expectations at his last stop and is ready for a high major role, but it's still a major jump in competition level for him. And for Traore, he said, this is going to be his 4th school. He hasn't been a positive impact player in terms of statistics. To this point in his career, in terms of on-off numbers, he hasn't had great numbers. So that's going to need to be something Butler has to unlock. Even if they do, it's a 2-center roster. They don't really have anybody behind those 2 guys that can play the 5, at least on paper. So they're going to be much smaller than they've been in the past up front. If either of those guys gets into foul trouble or has, fingers crossed, injury concerns this season, Butler's going to have a different look at the five. Could be really looking to play differently. If either of those guys has issues, then they're going to have to play smaller throughout the lineup.
Yep, and with Butler, I think that they're one of the more intriguing teams that's not necessarily in a lot of people's way too early preseason top 25s, top 40s in all of college basketball, because I do think that it could be a little bit of boom or bust with what you talked about with the big men. But as we went with Traore, started off his career at Auburn, looked relatively rock solid when he was over at UC Santa Barbara as well. So I do think that there's some upside there, as there's always upside when we do have our good friend in Lukas Harkins joining me right here on Cusco Soups. And that leads me to this question, because you've been doing such a great job looking at things here in the offseason in college basketball. Who's a team or two that you take a look at that might not be in a lot of people's top 15, top 20 with regards to preseason, that you just really like what they've done in this offseason and you feel like they have a chance to be able to surprise?
I really like what Virginia's done with Ryan Odom coming in. I think they've put together some really good scorers and shooters in that group. Malik Thomas can obviously fill up the basket. Ja'Gari White and Sam Lewis are great shooters that I think can get them back on track in terms of being a high-level three-point shooting team from the perimeter. I'm still going to buy into Iowa with Ben McCollum moving over there. Maybe it's just two head coaches that I like taking over new spots. But I think that giving a coach who does such a good job of creating three-point shots and a star who does such a good job of creating three-point shots in Bennett Sturtz, a guy like Brendan Hausen who can really light it up from deep, a versatile big man who can play inside, outside, block shots, make plays in the perimeter, and Alvaro Fogueres from Robert Morris. They'll play slow. They have a great decision maker in Sturtz to lead them off. I think that I was poised for a pretty solid season in their first year under McCollum in the Big Ten. So those are two teams I'm giving solid consideration as preseason top 25 potential groups. A team that maybe hasn't always been a big transfer portal group. Losing John Tonje and Stephen Carl, obviously significant. Wisconsin brings back John Blackwell. I think bringing in Nick Boyd from San Diego State and Austin Rabb from Portland gives them two really solid spots. Boyd is able to take some of that ball handling pressure off of Blackwell at the one. Rabb coming in from Portland gives them a shooting threat in the front court that they obviously lose with Carl departing. I think Wisconsin's, they're always consistent and they don't really get discussed very much from May through October. But as soon as Big Ten Media Day rolls around and you see them in that top half of the conference again, then they take the floor and they look like that kind of team. They're a program that doesn't get discussed as much in the offseason because none of their moves are significant, newsworthy moves, but they get them into position to win games November through March.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned Wisconsin as well, because I'm not sure if you'd agree with this statement, but I felt like the Big Ten had the best offseason of any conference out there in college basketball with all the coaching hires that you mentioned. Obviously, Iowa bringing in McCollum, but additionally, Minnesota, they were able to get a whole lot better with Nico Medved. Indiana, I think that they're on the up and up as well. We saw Michigan have the draft decision go their way of being able to bring in Yaxel Lendeborg, and I just look up and down at the Big Ten, and really other than a team like Rutgers, I feel like everyone's having a good offseason. Even Washington bringing in Desmond Claude late in the process, I feel like they got a whole lot better too.
Yeah, but someone's going to have to win those games and someone's going to have to lose those games, right? That's going to put the Big Ten in. It's going to be a highly competitive league as it always is, but perhaps even deeper this season, and will put a lot of pressure on which teams can defend their home courts more than others.
Yep, no question about it. And I know that you, Lukas, are doing an absolutely tremendous job taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. You do a great job on the bracketology front, but you do so much more. You're locked in here in the offseason, and you're certainly locked in on the Butler Bulldogs as well. So love to get people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Thanks as always for having me on. You guys can find me on Twitter at Hardwired Sports. I write for Heat Check College Basketball throughout the offseason. Got some good stuff coming over the next few months as we preview what's going to be, really another great and fun college basketball season coming up.
It's going to be an amazing season, and I know that over there at Heat Check CBB, everyone's doing great work. Lukas is doing supreme work taking a look at this great game, and every single time he joins me, lends such great insight. So big thanks to Lukas for joining me right here on Coast to Coast Soups, now part of the XII Family Podcast. And if you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Soups, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways we'll fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at GUnit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter, so per usual, please send these into the timeline, and the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. Then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review, and I am with you guys every single day on this podcast. Regular season and off season, we're up to north of 2,000 days without a missed podcast, so I feel like I've been pretty good money in the bank there, and I will continue to be to get us set for what is going to be a magnificent upcoming college basketball season. So I appreciate you guys joining me today, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.